Hey folks, welcome to another Broken Meeple review, and I hope you like sheep. Lots of them. Because today's game is basically all about sheep. Lowlands. This is I have to say, an unexpected game to come out. Because I knew nothing of this game originally. This wasn't on my radar, I didn't look it up, I didn't see it at the expo for some bizarre reason, I probably missed it at the stand. And then all of a sudden it just appeared on the new releases list. And it's like, oh, okay. Another farming-esque game. Ooh, I've got to check this one out and see what it's all about. Well, apparently, this is a Z-Man game made by C&R Partenheimer. I hope I'm getting that name right. But it's co-developed in conjunction with Uri Rosenberg. So it's important to note that this is not an Uri Rosenberg game. He is not the designer, but he has essentially co-developed it with these people. So much so that there's even a brand on the back saying that this is part of the Uri Rosenberg collection. You know, just to say that, you know, he's involved and it's very much his kind of style. Question is it? In some ways, pretty much yes. We'll get onto that more later. So in Lowlands, you are in a unnamed country in the North Sea, and you are basically trying to raise a farm of primarily sheep. You're building up your farm with different buildings, but you're fencing in sheep in order to gain more points at the end of the game for the value of them. But in conjunction with this, you are also trying to fight back the flood from the nearby sea. Because in that region, you know, floods are commonplace, you know, it's a pretty, frisky sea to put it mildly. And, you know, flooding is a major concern. So you have a dike that you are building in collaboration with the other players in order to stop the flood from hurting your farm. You don't cover your farm with any water pieces or anything, but you basically put these little water pieces up in a wall and you build the dike segments in front of it, and depending on which one is higher than the other dictates at the end of a round whether flood happens, and at the end of the game whether, you know, sheep and pastures end up getting lost. It doesn't stipulate exactly what's going on when the flood hits. It kind of hints towards that, you know, your pastures get flooded and you sell off your sheep. But yeah, you could look at this in a much more morbid way if your mind was tuned that way. Let's put it that way. So with this in mind, you know, you are trying to balance between building up your farm and building up the dike, because if you ignore one completely over the other, you run the risk of screwing yourself over. But then if the players do not work together enough to build up the dike, then somebody, at least one or two people, are going to get screwed by the time the game ends. So theme-wise, this does pretty well. This gives me that same sort of feel as a lot of Uri Rosenberg's other farming games. Think Agricola Light, but people are trying to compare this to Agricola, and that's not quite right, I would say. I would say that this has more in line with the two-player version, Agricola All Creatures Great and Small. That one was a light Agricola where you pretty much ignored everything to do with occupations and farming vegetables and that, and you concentrated on fencing animals on your little farm and building little buildings. Well, that is essentially half of what this game is. You have your board, you have fences, you have sheep, just sheep, no horses and cows or anything, and you are fencing those in, and you're building occasional buildings or feature tiles. You know, you get some that aren't just sheds and that, you get some water features and stuff for your farm. And, you know, you're building these up in order to try and store as many sheep as you can. Because in all these farming games, there's always a storage limit when it comes to the number of animals in each pasture. Well, here, it's a bit more restrictive, so you need to come up with ways from expanding your farm to actually house enough of the sheep on your farm. However, then, you know, the theme of that is pretty strong, but then of course you have the dike aspect, which, you know, makes sense for the setting. That is exactly what, you know, the countries in the North Sea had to deal with, and it is very much that tense battle between, you know, trying to keep the dike higher than the flood levels, but only wanting to cooperate as much as you feel like. It depends on what your strategy is, but you've got this cool, interaction with other players, you know, that you don't get in a lot of Euros for who's going to build up to the dike. Is somebody not pulling their weight? Is someone taking, you know, storming off with lots of dike reputation points, that kind of thing? And it's a, you know, it's a cool, neat back and forth for how it works. I was definitely quite impressed with how the theme and setting just seems to work It makes learning the game very intuitive. You know, the rules in this are not very complex. I would say this is medium weight at most in terms of it. This is definitely probably one of the lighter games in the sort of like farming game ranges, if that makes sense. But, you know, everything kind of makes sense. It's like, yes, I have my fields. Sheep go in pastures. There's a limit to how many sheep I can have. You know, buildings and stables hold more sheep. You know, the dike keeps the flood away. If the flood happens, your pastures, you know, you have to sell off the sheep. The sheep devalues if there's too much of a supply of them. You know, it all makes nice, easy sense. Teaching this was an absolute, you know, piece of cake. I had no problems getting this to the table with any players that I put it through. Granted, I would not put this as a, you know, a light game, you know, so maybe new gamers might want to stay away from this just for a bit, but certainly anybody who's even remotely familiar with this style of game is going to instantly pick it up. It has a small element of worker placement, a small element of, you know, action point allowance mechanism, and of course the great tile placement and resource management building up your farm in front of you. So it's got a nice collection of little mechanics thrown together in this nice mix that just works. It gels very smoothly. Component wise, pretty decent. You've got sheep meeples, just like you've seen before. You've got a nice board, you know, the artwork's pretty good. You better get used to green and blue, but to be fair, green and blue are my favourite colours, that works with me. But, you know, the artwork is not stellar, but it works. It's got a very nice picturesque view of like a coastline farm with the sea in the distance, and your player boards have got little features like hedges and watering holes on them now and again. Your fences are the same as you've seen them before, you know, little wooden sticks, but the tiles are decent quality, the graphic design is easy to recognise, you know, generally it's a pretty good production all round. You know, nothing totally stellar, but it's very typical of what Z-Man puts out with these style of games, and it works. It's certainly getting your money's worth in terms of components. I do particularly like having the little flood pieces, which if your experience is wide enough, if you remember a game called Firenze, where you were building up tower blocks and that, it looks exactly like those pieces, except now you're building up a wall of water. The dike pieces could have been maybe a little bit more interesting. They are basically just different shaped bricks. But, you know, it looks cool when you build everything up in a wall and see it sort of in a kind of 3D-esque nature in front of you. So, all in all, decent production, and I like it for what it is. Now the farming aspect is all well and good. I enjoy that, you know, you're building up the farm, you've got a variety of different tiles, they change with each game because you won't see them all in every game, and there's a selection of like end game scoring tiles of which you'll see 3 to 4 out of 6 roughly, it depends on player count, and you know, these can help you aim for a particular strategy. So there's some good variety in the types of buildings you can build into your farm. So that element I really, really like. The dike element is going to maybe divide a few people, but I was a fan of it as well, because the first game I played, I focused mainly on the dike and didn't care too much about my farm. The other 2 players I was with concentrated more on their farm, but they did contribute to the dike now and again. So I was able to storm ahead on the dike track points-wise, whereas they were kind of lagging behind and had to deal with the ramifications of us not making the target for the dike. Now, you know, that worked as well, and I've had games where we've all had a nice balance, I've had games where I've been the one neglecting the dike, and it does end up with some very different results, and sometimes close scoring. The times where you've got to be a little bit wary of, and this is a little bit of a flaw with the teaching, is that you must let players know that if you let somebody dominate the dike track without keeping them in check, you will lose. Because the time I did that was, you know, we weren't certain what the ramifications were for like neglecting the dike to a certain extent, but I basically had control over the damage that they had on their farm, because if you don't meet the conditions of the dike level, then you end up suffering breach marker tokens which hurt you at the end of the game, and you know, you suffer little penalties for being last on the dike track. So it's not necessarily a bad thing to be in the middle, but you certainly don't want to be last on that dike track forever. But at the end of the game, if the dike still doesn't beat back the flood, then you end up losing a lot of your sheep and money in the process, depending on how far somebody is ahead on the dike track compared to you. And if, like in my case, I was storming ahead, because that was my focus with all the buildings and that, then yeah, the rulebook says no sheep actually die in this game, but I must have effectively caused the horrific sheep holocaust of 2018, when I pretty much wiped out half their farms because they were so far behind me on the dike track when I had control over when it burst, because I was the last person to act. So I had a choice. Do I contribute to the dike and succeed and get a bit of money, or do I let it flood and then everybody else suffers so many negatives that, you know what, I'm happy. I still have a functioning farm and they all lose a ton of sheep and property. It's quite morbid when you start thinking that literally I basically decided, you know what, let the farms and all the sheep and pastures, you know, flood away into the distance. It's like, ugh, evil. But, you know, that's kind of the control you have in this game. But the interaction is definitely solid. Most Euros are like, fine, yeah, I'm going to do my stuff, and what are they doing? Couldn't really care less, you know. This is different, though, because obviously you've got the usual worker placement thing of, you know, you have your own spaces, so you choose where you want to go. Nobody's blocking you. But someone might take your buildings before they do, and again, that's pretty indirect. However, where the interaction comes in is with the dike, because you know, as well as deciding who's going to, you know, help out and how much do you want to help, how much do you badly want to beat the flood or not, you've also got a forced mechanism where after you contribute to the dike, you must ask another player to help you out. And they get the opportunity to build as much as you did for free as a result. Now, whether you deliberately choose a player who you know can't physically build on the dike because the resources you use are restricted, or you let someone help out who you know is, yeah, they're far enough back on the dike track and they've got all the resources in the world, you know what, can you contribute to this dike? It's really cool back and forth, and it's this nice level interaction that's not heavy interaction. We're not talking like, you know, cosmic encounter or diplomacy levels of negotiation here. But it's a nice refreshing change from Euros, which can be so dry, so bland, so like multiplayer solitaire. It's nice to get something that finally, you know, doesn't take it to revolutionary levels, but at least is a step in the right direction that I want to see in more Euros. The variety in the box is decent. There's a nice amount of buildings for each. You will eventually start seeing them all, you know, eventually, you know, not in the same game, but over 2 or 3 games you'll have seen every single tile. And they're similar in how they work, but there's variations. You've got different stacks depending on whether they help you out for sheep, for building or money, that kind of thing, or dike construction. And the idea is that they do similar things, but there is a good variety, and there are other ways to get victory points as a result of building them. So they lead to some interesting paths to victory. Now, granted, in the long run, I would like to see an expansion for this game, and I would literally, all I want to see is more buildings. Don't give me more mechanics, don't give me more confusing stuff in that, you know, just give me more tiles. Because it feels very streamlined and the game is not overly complex. I can teach it easily, and I think it should stay that way. Just give me more buildings, more stuff to build, and, you know, all's well and good. So overall, Lowlands is a pretty solid Euro game, actually. I had no idea it was coming out. This is what probably my poster child definition of a hidden gem is. It was hidden in plain sight from me all this time. I didn't realise it ever existed. Then I played it and realised, wow, I wish I'd been tracking this game because it is a gem. You know, I'm not going to say best Euro ever, but certainly a decent one. And I'm umming and ahhing as to whether this could hit my top 100 because, you know, I'm at this cutoff point with the top 100 list and it's like, can it make it on there? Can it make it on there? Because I've played enough games of it. You know, I'm very tempted. We'll have to see. But it's definitely a contender because this is kind of what I was expecting something like Nooseford to be. When that came out, it was, you know, it's a more simple Euro in Uri Rosenberg style. And I played it and I found it average. I found it okay, but it didn't leave much of an impression on me, so it hasn't really, like, won me over. This is more what I wanted from that, you know, light to mid-weight level farming style game, farming style Euro game that's not as overly complex as Caverna, Agricola, Fields of Isle, whatever your poison is, and, you know, just gets the job done. So, Lowlands, hidden gem. Really enjoy it. You know, so far, definitely, I think scores. I think it could use a bit more variety. That is my only thing. With the buildings, there's some of them, but I feel they're going to get sterile after a while. And the whole thing with player count, it doesn't scale perfectly well. Because you've got 2, 3 or 4 players. 4 players is great. 3 players is the ultimate sweet spot. 2 players is okay, but you lose a bit of that interaction with the dike in 2 players. This is not a game I would buy if you're fixed on 2 players. 3 and 4 though, you're looking pretty strong here. So I'd give it about an 8 personally. It's a solid Euro game. Definitely want to check out if you have any liking of farming style games, if you want a bit more interaction in your Euros, or if you're just a fan of anything that's got remote feelings of Uri Rosenberg. like I do. You know, I don't love all his games, but I do like quite a good few of them, and certainly, you know, I like farming as a theme. It just works for me. And no, that's not because I'm from the West Country. Okay, so that's it for me on the Broken Meeple. I'll see you on the next show. Take care. And regardless of whether your sheep are grazing nicely in the field or are being swept away by large tsunami waves, it's still only a game. So don't take it too far, okay? Take care. See you soon.